Usually when we talk about a recording studio, um, there is this massive underlying assumption of control.
Oh, absolutely. Control is like the whole point of the room.
Right. I mean, think about the physical space of a high-end studio. You've got these soundproofed walls. They're lined with that thick acoustic foam to kill any rogue echoes.
Yeah, the isolation booths.
Exactly, the isolation booths. Like, if a band wants to record a guitar, the audio engineer comes in, sets up this highly sensitive microphone, isolates the amplifier, and runs the signal through a pristine mixing board.
They're essentially trapping the sound in a sterile vacuum.
Yeah, which is comforting, really. I mean, we like our audio to be organized. We want it perfectly categorized into these neat little tracks that we can just easily manipulate.
It's an environment built entirely around the philosophy of quarantine.
That's a good word for it. Quarantine.
Because you are actively trying to protect the music from the outside world. Like, you really don't want the sound of a passing siren or the hum of a refrigerator bleeding into the lead vocal take.
Right. It is the absolute definition of an acoustic laboratory.
Yeah.
But that brings us to the core of our deep dive today. What happens when you don't want to keep the outside world out?
Or what happens when you can't, right?
Exactly. What happens when the outside world is so incredibly overwhelming, so tense, and so fractured that trying to keep it out just feels like a lie?
That is the big question.
So today, we are looking at how one incredibly obscure band from the late 1970s took that completely sterile concept of a recording studio, dragged it into a literal industrial meat locker, and essentially dismantled all the structural rules of music.
Yeah, and we are pulling the framework for this discussion from a really deeply researched retrospective column.
Right, from MMR.
Yes, Monumental Movement Records. And the piece is titled, "This Heat, the Deepest Part of Post-Punk That Recorded the Era of Disconnection."
It's such a heavy title, but it's so accurate.
It really is. And what makes this particular analysis so compelling is that it doesn't treat this band, this Heat, as just, another group of musicians trying to score a record deal and get on the radio.
No, not at all.
It treats them as an acoustic mirror to a very specific, deeply uncomfortable moment in human history.
Which is why I want to set this up with a thought experiment.
Yeah.
Because if you're listening to this right now, the music we are going to describe might initially sound completely alien to you.
Oh, it will definitely sound alien to a lot of people.
So you really have to put yourself in this headspace. Imagine you are living in an era of severe, cascading economic collapse.
And we're not talking about a standard dip in the stock market here.
No, we mean systemic collapse. There are widespread labor strikes paralyzing the entire infrastructure around you.
Right.
Unemployment is just skyrocketing. You are constantly bombarded by this media ecosystem, feeding you these fractured, terrifying updates.
Every single day.
Yeah, and hanging over every single aspect of your daily existence is the very real, constant threat of total nuclear annihilation.
You're describing a state of perpetual, inescapable dread.
That's exactly it.
It's that tension that you feel in your jaw when you wake up and in your chest when you try to sleep at night.
Exactly. Now, here's a question at the center of this deep dive. How do you make music that sounds like that?
It's a tough brief for any artist.
It is. And I need to be very specific here. I do not mean writing a folk punk protest song with lyrics about the economy or singing a song about the bomb.
Right, no lyrical metaphors.
No. I mean, how do you engineer an acoustic soundscape that physically embodies the biological feeling of that panic?
And that is the core thesis we're exploring today. Because while the vast majority of their musical peers in the late 70s were simply updating rock and roll's playing style.
Like playing faster.
Yeah, playing their instruments faster, or maybe turning the amplifiers up louder, or just adopting a more aggressive aesthetic. But this Heat decided to completely deconstruct the architecture of sound itself.
And just tore it down.
They really did. The argument from the MMR piece is that by abandoning the traditional rules of rhythm, melody, and recording, they didn't just reflect the analog anxiety of the 1970s.
They somehow went further.
Yeah, they somehow managed to predict the algorithmic, highly fragmented anxiety of our modern digital age. And they did it almost 40 years before it actually happened.
Which is just mind-blowing. But to really grasp the magnitude of what they were dismantling, we have to look closely at what they were reacting to in the first place.
The environment is everything here.
Right. So if you were walking the streets of the UK in the late 1970s, what exactly were you feeling? Because, we often romanticize the
Oh,
70s.
definitely. Disco, bell-bottoms, classic rock.
Exactly. But the reality in Britain at that time was incredibly grim, wasn't it?
It was a deeply destabilized society. To understand the environment this heat was operating in, you have to look at the macroeconomic and social realities of the time.
Okay, unpack that for us.
Specifically, we're looking at the late 70s, leading into what became known as the Winter of Discontent in 1978 and 1979.
The winter of discontent.
Yeah. We are talking about a country experiencing completely rampant inflation. The government was trying to cap pay rises to curb that inflation, and that just led to massive, widespread strikes across the public sector.
And these weren't just like abstract, localized strikes, right? This was visceral.
Oh, highly visceral.
Yeah.
You had refuse collectors on strike.
So garbage.
Yes, which meant garbage was literally piling up in these massive mountains in public squares in London.
I just can't even imagine that smell.
Right. And you had grave diggers on strike, lorry drivers were striking, which led to immediate supply chain shortages and panic buying in all the supermarkets.
So the physical landscape of the country just felt like it was breaking down.
It was breaking down. And on top of this domestic economic collapse, you had an alarming expansion of far-right political factions.
Right, literally marching in the streets.
Exactly, which created this highly volatile, dangerous social atmosphere.
And just to be clear, for everyone listening, as we discuss these historical elements, we are strictly looking at the societal environment as an incubator for art.
Yes, absolutely.
We aren't taking any political stances on the labor disputes or the governmental policies of the era. We are just mapping the immense pressure cooker that these musicians were living inside.
And the ultimate lid on that pressure cooker was the Cold War.
Oh, man. Yeah, that cannot be overstated.
It really can't. The threat of a nuclear exchange between the West and the Soviet Union wasn't just some political talking point on the evening news.
It was a reality.
It was an intimate, daily psychological weight. I mean, people were given government pamphlets on how to build makeshift fallout shelters in their own living rooms.
Wait, using what?
Using mattresses and doors.
Mattresses and doors against a nuclear blast.
Yeah.
That is terrifying.
Right, and the concept of the 4-minute warning, this idea that you would only have 4 minutes to prepare for the end of the world if a missile was launched, that was a pervasive cultural trauma.
4 minutes? I mean, if you're surrounded by that level of existential dread and societal decay, your natural human instinct is either to hide or to scream. And musically, a lot of people chose to scream. Because this is 1976 and 1977. This is ground zero for the punk rock explosion.
The Sex Pistols, The Clash, The Damned.
Exactly. So if things were so terrible, my question is, why didn't the guys in this heat just buy some cheap guitars, crank up the distortion, and write angry 3-chord punk anthems?
It seems like the obvious choice, right?
Yeah. Wasn't that the established formula for dealing with this exact environment?
It was the formula, but punk rock, for all its aggressive posturing and rebellious energy, was structurally very conservative.
Wait, conservative. That sounds like a contradiction. How is punk conservative?
Well, think about the actual mechanics of a punk song. Yes, the lyrics are rebellious.
Sure.
Yes, the guitars are loud and heavily distorted. Yes, the singer is sneering instead of crooning. But beneath that aesthetic layer, a punk song operates on the exact same fundamental musical architecture as the classic rock and roll it claims to hate.
Oh, I see what you mean.
Right. It still uses a standard 44-time signature. It still uses basic blues-derived chord progressions.
It still goes verse, chorus, verse.
Exactly. Punk was a lyrical and cultural rebellion, but it wasn't a structural rebellion. It provided a sense of catharsis.
You jump around, you sweat, you scream the chorus, and you feel a little bit better at the end of the show.
Right. But catharsis implies a release of tension.
Ah. And if you're living in an era where the tension literally never releases, where the garbage is still in the streets and the nuclear missiles are still pointed at you, then a cathartic 3-chord pop song might start to feel, well, like a distraction.
It might feel completely insufficient.
Sorry.
And that realization is the catalyst for what music historians call the post-punk divergence.
The branching out.
Right. After the initial shockwave of punk, musicians started looking around and realizing that simply playing Chuck Berry riffs twice as fast wasn't going to cut it anymore.
So the musical tree rapidly branched out.
Yeah. Some bands leaned heavily into the newly affordable electronic synthesizers to create these cold, robotic soundscapes, some integrated dub and reggae rhythms.
But this heat chose an entirely different vector. I mean, they formed in 1976, right in the absolute middle of the punk explosion.
But they actively refuse to offer that cathartic release.
If punk was about smashing a guitar on stage, this heat was about taking the guitar apart with a screwdriver to see if the loose wires could generate a frequency that sounded like a panic attack.
That is a perfect analogy. They wanted to dismantle the structures of rock music from the outside in.
It's just wild.
And when critics and the source material describe this Heat's music as apocalyptic, it's super important to understand the mechanism behind that word.
Right, they weren't like Alice Cooper or something.
No, exactly. They were not a theatrical horror rock band. They didn't wear scary makeup or sing about zombies or monsters.
The apocalypse in their music wasn't a fantasy.
No, it was a documentary. It was the literal raw sensation of a destabilized society engineered directly into an acoustic space.
Which brings us to the actual architects of this deconstruction. Because if you want to break down the fundamental rules of rock and roll, you need a very specific set of musicians.
People who understand those rules well enough to invert them.
Yes. So let's look at the three members of this heat, starting with their drummer and vocalist, Charles Hayward. What was his musical DNA?
Well, Hayward's background is deeply revealing because he actually came from the world of progressive rock or prog rock.
Oh, wow. Prog rock.
Yeah, he had been a member of a band called Quiet Sun, which was loosely connected to the very technical, highly complex Roxy music scene.
Okay, for anyone who might not be deep into 70s music genres, prog rock is essentially the polar opposite of punk.
Oh, completely.
Like, if punk is a 2-minute song with 3 chords, prog rock is a 20-minute song with 15 different time signature changes, synthesizers that sound like orchestras, and like lyrics about mythological creatures.
It's highly mathematical, and it often requires incredible technical virtuosity to even play it.
It requires an immense amount of control.
Right. But Hayward had grown completely exhausted by that virtuosity.
He's just burned out on it.
Yeah, he felt that playing incredibly complex 20-minute solos was just showing off. He felt it had lost its emotional core.
So what did he want?
He wanted music that was direct and highly physical, but he didn't want to revert to the simplistic backbeat of traditional rock either.
So he takes his immense technical ability, but instead of using it to play complex drum fills, he uses it to warp time.
Yes. The analysis of his drumming style in the source text is fascinating.
Break it down for us, because the primary job of a drummer in any band, from a jazz trio to a heavy metal group, is to provide the pulse, right?
Right. The drummer is the foundation. If the drummer speeds up or slows down by accident, the entire band falls apart.
So what did Hayward do?
Hayward took that foundational responsibility and weaponized it.
Weaponize the beat.
Exactly. He would establish a repetition, a groove that the listener could latch onto, and then he would deliberately, mathematically, begin to break it down.
Oh.
He would shift the accents of his hits by microfractions of a second.
Think about the mechanics of how the human brain processes rhythm for a second. We are pattern recognition machines, right?
Basically, yeah.
When we hear a steady 44-beat boom, clack, our brain predicts the next hit.
And when the hit lands exactly where we expect it to, our brain gives us a tiny hit of dopamine.
Right. That's why tapping your foot to a good beat feels so satisfying. What Hayward did was explicitly deny that dopamine hit.
It's complete rhythmic instability.
It's like walking on a treadmill. I love this analogy.
Oh, the treadmill analogy is great.
Imagine you go to the gym, you set the treadmill to a comfortable jogging speed, and you find your stride. Your body goes into autopilot.
You're just cruising.
Right. Now imagine the motor of that treadmill starts glitching. The overall speed is generally the same, but the belt suddenly accelerates for a split second, then lags, then stutters.
Oh, that sounds horrible.
You are still jogging, but your autopilot is destroyed. You suddenly have to devote all your conscious attention just to stay upright.
Because the ground beneath you feels like it's physically warping.
Yes. You feel a sudden spike in cortisol, which is stress. And that is exactly what listening to Charles Hayward's drumming feels like.
And that technique of weaponizing complex, shifting time signatures laid the direct groundwork for what would later become known as math rock.
It forces the listener to engage with the music anxiously rather than passively.
Exactly. You cannot just put this Heat record on in the background while you wash the dishes. It demands your uncomfortable attention.
Okay, so Hayward is actively dismantling the rhythm. But rhythm is only half the battle in a rock band.
True.
If your drummer is constantly warping the flow of time, Your guitarist can't exactly play a standard Chuck Berry blues riff over the top of it.
No, it wouldn't fit at all. It would sound ridiculous.
So they had to completely reinvent the function of the guitar to match that rhythmic instability. Which brings us to Charles Bullen.
Yes.
He handled guitar, tapes, and electronics.
And calling what Bullen did playing guitar is almost a failure of vocabulary.
How so?
Because he completely abandoned the traditional concept of the riff. You weren't going to hear him play a catchy melody or a standard power chord.
So what was he doing with it?
Instead, he treated the electric guitar more like an industrial tool for generating acoustic textures.
The source notes he used the guitar to build spaces, using fragmented noise, metallic echoes, and endlessly sustained notes. But how do you even achieve that practically?
Right, because if you just strum an electric guitar, it sounds like an electric guitar.
Exactly.
It all comes down to how you process the signal. Normally, a guitarist plugs into an amplifier that makes the natural sound of the strings louder. But Bullen treated his guitar the way a sound designer treats a synthesizer.
Oh, okay. Explain that.
Well, a synthesizer generates a raw electronic waveform, and the player uses filters and modulators to carve that waveform into a specific sound.
Right.
Bullen would strike a string on his guitar, but then he would run that sound through chains of rudimentary effects, pedals, tape delays, and physical manipulations.
So by the time the sound actually hit the speaker,
It was completely unrecognizable as a guitar.
he's just generating raw frequencies. I mean, a metallic echo isn't just a sound. It's a feeling of vast, cold emptiness.
Yes. He's building the physical environment of an abandoned factory using 6 strings and a piece of wood.
Which is brilliant.
Yeah,
He's providing the atmosphere while Hayward is warping the gravity.
that's a great way to put it.
Which leaves us with the third member, Gareth Williams, who handled keyboards, tape manipulation, vocals, and basically any other object in the room he could strike.
The ultimate wild card.
Right. Because if you already have a rhythm section that makes you feel anxious and a guitar that sounds like an industrial accident, what space is even left for a third person in the sonic spectrum?
The space of absolute unpredictability.
Unpredictability.
Yeah. Williams was not a trained virtuoso like Hayward. In fact, he was brought into the band specifically because he didn't have those ingrained traditional musical instincts.
He was a non-musician.
Pretty much. The source describes him as injecting a massive dose of fragmented sensibilities into the group.
And the psychology of what Williams brought to the table is so incredibly manipulative to the listener.
It really is. The source details how he would intentionally inject something totally jarring into the middle of a track.
But he wouldn't just add more noise, right?
No. He might introduce a very simple, almost childlike keyboard melody.
A nursery rhyme amidst a thunderstorm.
Exactly.
And think about what that does to your brain. You are bracing yourself against the harshness of Bullen's metallic noise and Hayward's shifting rhythms. You're all tense.
And suddenly you hear this sweet, simple melody.
And your brain immediately relaxes. You think, okay, here is the safe harbor. Here is the actual song.
And the exact millisecond you lower your defenses, Williams would plunge the entire track back into near-collapsing harsh noise.
It creates a state of perpetual acoustic whiplash.
It does. And the source emphasizes a crucial realization about their band dynamic here. This Heat's sound was not the result of 3 musicians harmonizing.
Which is the entire point of a traditional band.
Usually, yes.
You find a key, you find a tempo, and you harmonize. You work together.
Right. But this Heat's music was the result of 3 musicians constantly colliding with one another.
Just crashing into each other.
Exactly. They didn't have rigid roles. Hayward wouldn't just stay behind the drum kit. His rhythms would bleed into the tape loops.
And Bullen's guitar would try to mimic the percussion.
While Williams's keyboards would actively fight against the vocal melodies, the friction between the 3 of them was the primary mechanism generating their sound.
But practically speaking, this introduces a massive logistical nightmare.
Oh, a huge one.
Because if you have 3 guys whose entire musical philosophy is based on colliding, physically swapping instruments, creating harsh industrial noise, and breaking all the rules of traditional rock, where do you physically put them?
You definitely don't put them in Soho.
No. You can't walk into a pristine, expensive commercial recording studio in London, look at an audio engineer who gets paid by the hour, and say, hey, we're going to make a metallic racket and deliberately play out of time to the next week.
The engineer would throw you out immediately.
And even if they didn't, you'd run out of money in 2 days.
Which is why the necessity of extreme isolation led to what many consider the 4th member of this Heat.
Right. A place called cold storage.
Yes.
The name alone is perfect. Tell us about cold storage, because this wasn't just a metaphor, was it?
No, it's a very literal description. In 1977, they managed to secure a space in a former refrigerated warehouse in South London,
A literal meat locker.
an industrial meat locker, and they slowly converted it into a completely independent DIY studio. They built their own baffles, brought in their own gear, and made it their absolute base of operations.
Which is wild because the physical acoustics of a refrigerated warehouse are the exact opposite of that plush, soundproof commercial studio we talked about at the beginning.
The exact opposite.
You have hard industrial surfaces, you have a massive cavernous space where the temperature is notoriously difficult to control.
Sound waves are going to bounce off those cold walls in ways that a traditional acoustic engineer would consider an absolute nightmare.
But for this heat, that was the point.
It was the entire point. The source column explains that getting away from the constraints and the ticking clock of commercial studios was their most decisive move.
Because inside cold storage, the studio wasn't just a room where they recorded music.
The studio was the instrument.
I really want to pause and drill down into the physical mechanics of what they were doing in that space, because I think we take this stuff for granted now.
Oh, we definitely do.
Today, if an electronic producer wants to slice up a drum beat, reverse a vocal, or loop a guitar riff, they open a program like Ableton or Logic Pro on their laptop.
It's all on a screen.
Right. They highlight the audio waveform with their mouse, they hit Command-C, they hit Command-V, and the loop is made in less than 2 seconds.
It is a totally frictionless digital process.
But this heat is doing this in the late 1970s. This is entirely pre-digital.
The friction was immensely physical. What they were doing in cold storage required manual labor.
Like actual sweat.
Yes. The primary recording medium was magnetic tape. If you want to understand how they achieved their sound, you really have to understand the grueling physical process of analog tape splicing.
Okay, walk us through the actual physics of it. If they record a 5-second burst of noise and they want to loop it so it repeats continuously, what do they physically have to do?
All right, so you have a reel of 1/4-inch magnetic tape spinning across the magnetic playback heads of a reel-to-reel machine.
Okay.
To create a loop, you have to physically find the exact start and end point of the sound you want on the tape.
By listening to it.
Yes, rolling it back and forth over the playhead. You mark the tape with a grease pencil, then you lay the tape onto a metal splicing block, and then you take a literal razor blade and slice the tape at a 45-degree angle.
Wait, why a 45-degree angle? Why not just cut it straight across?
Good question, because if you cut it straight across at a 90-degree angle, you'll hear a harsh pop or click when the tape passes over the playback head.
Oh, because it's a blunt transition.
Exactly. The 45-degree angle creates a microscopic physical crossfade, which allows the magnetic signal to blend slightly.
That is fascinating.
So you slice the start, you spool the tape out, you slice the end, and then you use a special adhesive splicing tape to stick the two ends together.
Creating a physical circle of magnetic tape.
Exactly.
And then you just thread that circle back onto the tape machine.
Well, if it's a very short loop, yes. But tape moves quickly, often 15 inches per second for high-quality audio.
Okay.
So if you want a loop that lasts for 10 seconds, that requires 150 inches of tape.
That's over 12 feet of fragile magnetic ribbon?
Yep. And a 12-foot loop of tape cannot fit on the standard reels of a tape machine.
So where does it go? Does it just spool onto the floor?
No, it goes out into the room. They would thread the tape through the machine and then literally run it out across the freezing space of cold storage.
You're kidding.
They would set up spare microphone stands around the room, put empty tape spools on them, and wrap the tape around those stands to create a massive room-sized physical circuit for the tape to travel along before returning to the playback head.
That is an incredible visual. I mean, you have these 3 musicians sitting in a freezing meat locker, surrounded by a web of literal magnetic tape stretching across the room like a giant mechanical spider web.
And the physical nature of that tape directly influenced the sound.
How so?
Because every time that 12-foot loop of tape passes over the magnetic playback head, microscopic particles of magnetic oxide are scraped off the tape.
Oh, wow. So the physical material actually degrades.
Yes.
So the sound degrades with it.
Exactly. The first time a loop plays, it sounds crisp. The 20th time it plays, it loses some high-end frequencies.
And the 50th time.
By the 50th time it plays, it sounds completely muffled, ghostly, and distant. The physical decay of the medium becomes part of the composition.
That is so profound. They weren't just walking into a room, playing a finished song together and capturing it on a microphone.
Not at all.
The physical act of slicing reality with a razor blade taping it back together and letting it degrade in real time, that was the composition.
And the MMR article extrapolates this point brilliantly. What this heat was doing in cold storage is the mechanical foundation of modern sampler culture.
Yes.
It's the entire digital audio workstation workflow that dominates 99% of music production today.
They were reverse engineering the concept of the modern studio before the technology even existed.
They really were. They were trying to build a digital aesthetic using crude analog tools.
But because they were using crude analog tools, the boundary between a deliberate performance, a harsh burst of noise, an accidental tape glitch, and a planned intention, it was all completely blurred.
You could not separate the music from the physical room it was constructed in.
So we have this environment. 3 chaotic musicians locked in a repurposed industrial meat locker, physically splicing miles of tape together with razor blades.
Yes.
What happens when they finally take these physical experiments and release them to the public as an album?
That brings us to their self-titled debut album, released in 1979, simply called This Heat.
And how did people react?
Well, the source describes this record as existing in a highly peculiar, almost solitary position within the history of post-punk.
I can imagine if you're a teenager in 1979 who just bought a Clash record and you put this on your turntable, your brain would probably short circuit.
Because it completely lacks any traditional rock stability.
None at all.
It functions more as an unnerving acoustic environment than a collection of songs. It's this unsettling collage built out of short fragments, bursts of harsh noise, severed rhythms, and environmental recordings they captured in the warehouse.
The source highlights a few specific tracks that really illustrate the mechanisms of their sound. Let's look at the track Horizontal Hold.
Oh, this is a great one.
For anyone who grew up with flat-screen digital televisions, the title might not make sense. But horizontal hold was a literal physical dial on the back of old CRT cathode ray tube televisions.
Right, because televisions used to drop pictures on a glass screen using a scanning electron beam.
And if the timing of that beam got slightly out of sync with the broadcast signal, the picture on the screen would start to roll vertically, or it would tear horizontally into these jagged lines of static.
Right, and you had to reach behind the TV and manually adjust the horizontal hold dial to force the picture back into a stable state.
The song Horizontal Hold is a brilliant piece of musical mimicry because the music literally behaves like a disrupted broadcast signal.
It really does.
The rhythm fluctuates violently. The guitars don't sound like chords, they sound like electronic static tearing across the screen.
It constantly threatens to lose its signal entirely. You're waiting for the music to stabilize, and it just refuses to.
It keeps you completely on edge.
And then the source points to another foundational track on that debut album called 24 Track Loop.
Now, this one is exactly what it says on the tin, right?
Yes. It is a vital fusion of minimal electronic music and intense physical tape experimentation.
So this is the tape loop stuff we were just talking about.
Exactly. It is essentially a repeating sequence, but constructed entirely by hand through the room-sized tape loops we were discussing.
Wow.
The source emphasizes that 24-track loop was deeply influential on later genres like industrial music and the broader noise scene.
I can definitely see that. I mean, it was completely revolutionary for a band that was ostensibly marketed as a rock group to release a track that featured zero traditional playing.
Right, and was entirely reliant on the structural manipulation of magnetic tape.
It highlights the central contradiction that stunned listeners at the time.
Which was?
They were presenting themselves in the format of a rock band, guitar, drums, keyboards, but explicitly denying the entire framework of rock.
Exactly. And they didn't achieve massive commercial radio success with this debut, but they sent a seismic shockwave through the musical underground.
They vastly expanded the parameters of what post-punk could be.
It didn't just have to be dark, angular rock music anymore. It could be pushed into the realm of pure acoustic experimentation.
And then they followed the debut up in 1980, right?
Yes, with an EP called Health and Efficiency,
Which the source mentions as a slight refinement of their chaos.
They blended really tight, repetitive, almost funk-inspired rhythmic grooves with their signature harsh acoustics.
It's almost as if they were daring you to try and dance to a collapsing building.
That's a great image. They were honing their ability to merge rhythm with noise.
But while the debut album and the EP were brilliant sonic experiments, their true masterpiece, the record that cemented their legacy, was born out of a sudden, terrifying shift in the global atmosphere.
Yes, we move into 1981, and we have to talk about their album, Deceit.
This is where the band transcends just doing cool, avant-garde studio tricks in a meat locker.
The stakes were suddenly elevated to an existential level.
Explain the historical context here because the source really digs into 1981.
It does. The column provides essential context.
Mm.
1981 saw a massive, dramatic escalation in Cold War tensions.
Right.
You had political posturing between superpowers reaching a fever pitch. The deployment of new intermediate-range nuclear missiles in Europe was a major, terrifying news story.
So this wasn't abstract anymore. It wasn't just a political chess game played by diplomats in closed rooms.
No, the fear of a sudden nuclear flash seeped into the psychology of everyday people trying to buy groceries or take the train to work.
And the MMR article makes a crucial point about deceit. The album didn't just adopt a dark vibe or a spooky dystopian aesthetic.
Not at all. It densely encoded the specific, suffocating atmosphere of 1981.
It translated the psychological state of sheer terror into the physical structure of the music.
Yes.
But how exactly do you encode terror into a structure? Let's look at the deep dives the source provides into the tracks. The album opens with a song called Sleep.
And from the very first seconds of Sleep, the listener is placed in an environment that sounds like it is on the brink of total, inescapable collapse.
Set the scene for us.
The track is driven by relentless, almost martial military-style snare drum rhythms.
But it's not a crisp, clean military march, is it?
No, it sounds exhausted. The vocals are urgent, strained, and desperate, and the vocal harmonies are deliberately dissonant.
Which is key because when human voices sing in harmony, it's supposed to sound unified and beautiful.
Right. But when this heat sang in harmony, they chose notes that physically rubbed against each other, creating a sense of acoustic friction.
You listen to it, and you feel a literal tightness in your chest.
Exactly. And the source then contrasts the urgency of Sleep with another standout track from the album, Cenotaph.
Okay, let's talk about Cenotaph. To understand the weight of this track, you have to understand the title.
A cenotaph is an empty tomb.
Right, it's a monument erected to honor people whose remains are elsewhere, and it's almost exclusively used to commemorate mass casualties of war.
It's a very heavy concept. And the article analyzes cenotaph as an acoustic vision of a post-nuclear world.
But crucially, it is not a preachy protest song.
No, there are no lyrics demanding peace or criticizing politicians.
Because that would shrink the scale of the dread, wouldn't it?
It would. Instead, the music itself balances a feeling of quiet, devastating resignation with a bizarre, eerie beauty.
So if Sleep is the sound of the panic right before the missiles hit,
then Cenotaph is the sound of the radioactive dust settling over a completely silent, empty city.
wow. I really want to emphasize the distinction the source makes here because it is the key to understanding this heat's genius.
The difference between them and the punk bands.
Yes, there is a massive psychological difference between shouting a political slogan like smash the state or ban the bomb, which dozens of punk bands were doing, versus what this heat achieved.
What they achieved was much more visceral.
This heat transformed the visceral somatic sensation of society collapsing into pure acoustic form. They didn't stand on a soapbox and tell you to be scared of the Cold War.
They engineered a frequency that forced your body to feel the exact vibration of that fear.
The source states that deceit represents a total fusion of politics and sonic experimentation.
They didn't describe the tension in the air. They managed to record the air itself.
Okay, but this brings up a massive, glaring practical question for me.
What's that?
If their entire musical identity relies on this hyper-meticulous, painstaking process, slicing tape with razor blades, running 12-foot loops across a freezing warehouse, degrading magnetic oxide, utilizing studio accidents, how on earth do you take this on the road?
It seems impossible, right?
So you just stand on a stage in front of a live audience and press play on a cassette deck.
You might assume that a band so reliant on the studio would be completely paralyzed in a live setting.
Yeah.
But the source reveals that this heat was actually just as radical and perhaps even more confrontational on stage as they were inside cold storage.
How did they pull that off? They didn't politely attempt to recreate the studio albums note for note, did they?
No, because you literally can't.
Right, you can't bring a meat locker on tour.
Exactly. Instead, the live experience became a new kind of experiment entirely. They did utilize massive amounts of live tape playback on stage.
Okay.
They would have reel-to-reel machines running backing loops, but they combined that pre-recorded chaos with real-time noise manipulation, aggressive physical playing, and massive amounts of improvisation.
The atmosphere in those venues must have been Absolutely feral.
It was completely unpredictable by design. The article notes that no two Theath Heat shows were ever the same.
So you didn't buy a ticket to this Heat concert to hear the hits and sing along.
No, you went to witness three human beings operating on the absolute verge of losing total control of their machinery.
I love the visceral description provided in the source. It says that attending one of their shows felt less like being at a traditional rock concert and more like being physically hurled inside a massive malfunctioning acoustic engine.
And Charles Hayward's live drumming was central to that feeling of destabilization.
Right, the treadmill effect we talked about.
Yes. The text notes that during live performances, he would constantly, subtly shift the accents of the beat.
So to a casual listener in the back of the room, it might look like he was playing a simple driving rock beat.
But by minutely shifting where the heavy strikes of the snare and bass drum landed, he would completely destabilize the physical feeling of the entire venue.
Again, it's that treadmill analogy, but applied to a room of 300 people.
The audience's physical sense of gravity was constantly being messed with.
And the article mentions that this left a lot of people totally baffled.
Understandably.
Imagine being a kid in 1980.
Oh.
You lay the Sex Pistols, you hear this band, this Heat is playing, you show up in your leather jacket wanting to slam dance, get that punk rock catharsis.
And instead, you walk into a room where you're getting your equilibrium systematically destroyed by tape loops, metallic guitar screeching, and a drummer who refuses to let you find the beat. It was undoubtedly alienating for the mainstream rock crowd.
But that extreme alienation also bred a fiercely loyal, cult-like following, didn't it?
It did. There was a specific demographic of listeners who craved this exact environment. They wanted to occupy this shared acoustic space.
It became a collective processing mechanism for the era's anxiety.
Exactly. They wanted to experience this feeling of impending collapse together in a dark room at a deafening volume.
But there is a biological limit to how long a human being can exist in that state.
Oh, definitely.
Which brings us to 1982 and the inevitable end of the band. Because this heat only existed for a few incredibly short, dense years.
It was an entirely unsustainable ecosystem.
Right.
The source breaks down the primary reasons for their breakup in 1982, and it's a confluence of pressures. Naturally, there were creative musical differences that arise in any group of highly opinionated artists.
Sure, that happens to everyone.
But more pressingly, there was severe mental and physical exhaustion from maintaining that level of extreme tension.
You cannot live in the red forever.
You really can't.
If you take a car engine and you redline it, pushing it past its engineered limits, it will produce an incredible, terrifying amount of raw power for a short burst.
But it is absolutely guaranteed to blow out.
Exactly. You are burning the machine alive. This heat was burning themselves alive to capture that sound.
And compounding the mental exhaustion was the stark reality of financial strain.
Yeah, pushing the boundaries of avant-garde noise rock in a freezing warehouse doesn't exactly generate massive royalty checks.
It does not. The article specifically notes that Gareth Williams, the wild card who brought so much of the jarring unpredictability to their sound, began pulling away from the spotlight.
The tension became too much.
Yeah, he distanced himself from the band's demanding activities.
So the engine blows out. In 1982, the band officially, physically dies.
Yes. Hayward and Bullen went on to form a project called Camberwell. Now, to continue exploring some of that rhythmic and sonic ethos, while Williams largely stepped away from the main stage of the music industry.
But what makes this deep dive so essential, and what I find so incredibly compelling about this MMR column, is its argument about what happened next.
The legacy.
Yes, the band died in 1982, but their ghost ends up haunting the next 40 years of modern music. The future arrives, and this heat is already there waiting for it.
The legacy section of this source material is highly illuminating because it details a delayed reaction.
Their reputation didn't die when they broke up.
In fact, it was barely beginning. A massive critical and artistic reevaluation swelled in the late 1980s and then absolutely exploded in the 1990s and into the 2000s.
They essentially became the Rosetta Stone for the post-rock movement.
Precisely. They deeply influenced an entire spectrum of fragmented experimental rock genres.
Like what?
We're talking post-rock, industrial music, math rock, avant rock. The column lists some heavy hitters who are direct, undeniable disciples of this heat.
Let's list some of those out.
We are talking about highly influential, critically acclaimed bands like Slint, Stereolab, Tortoise, Sonic Youth, Radiohead, and more recently the incredibly complex math rock band Black MIDI.
That is an insane pedigree of influential artists.
Mm.
If you trace the family tree of experimental rock music, all the roots lead back to cold storage.
They do.
But I have to ask a structural question here. Why this band?
What do you mean?
Well, let's be honest. This heat did not invent tape manipulation.
Oh, no, definitely not.
There were pure academic avant-garde composers, people like Karl-Heinz Stockhausen or John Cage, doing weird tape splicing and electronic noise experiments in university laboratories in the 1950s and 60s.
Right.
So why did this heat have such a massive visceral impact on modern rock bands rather than those contemporary classical guys?
The expert analysis in the source clarifies exactly that distinction, and it's a brilliant point. It's because this heat deliberately kept the visual and cultural format of rock bands.
Oh.
They presented as a drummer, a guitarist, and a keyboardist playing in grimy music venues. Exactly. By keeping the exterior of the house intact, but completely gutting and destroying the interior structures, the chords, the beats, the song lengths, they built a bridge between two worlds that rarely interacted.
That makes total sense.
If they had just been avant-garde academics wearing suits in a sterile laboratory, the punk and rock kids would never have listened to them.
The culture gap was too wide.
Right. But because this heat presented themselves as a sweaty, loud rock band, they gave future generations a template.
They showed kids how to push rock music to its absolute avant-garde limit without completely abandoning the format they loved.
They essentially snuck the avant-garde in through the back door of a dirty rock club.
They disguised high-concept deconstruction as a rock gig. And that brings us to the final, most chilling insight in the entire source text.
This is the part that really sticks with you.
This is the piece of the puzzle that really made me stop and reconsider everything we've talked about today. The MMR article argues that the specific analog anxieties of the late 70s, that this heat was capturing the feeling of fragmented information, the endless hum of background noise, the paranoia of surveillance, the constant low-level baseline tension of a society about to snap.
Yes.
These are the exact defining traits of our modern digital society today.
The parallel the author draws is incredibly striking.
It's spot on.
The column concludes that this heat didn't predict the future through some mystical prophecy. They didn't have a crystal ball.
Right.
They simply answered a fundamental, universal human question. When the systems of a society begin to destabilize and fracture, what kind of acoustic sounds do humans naturally produce to reflect that fracture?
A fractured society inevitably produces fractured sounds.
Exactly.
What this heat was doing with literal razor blades and magnetic tape in a freezing warehouse, slicing up information, creating infinite loops of repetitive noise, isolating fragments of reality out of context, that is the exact mechanical equivalent of what algorithms do to our digital lives today.
The mechanics of analog splicing map perfectly onto the mechanics of the digital feed.
It's eerie.
The source argues that this is why listening to this heat today doesn't feel like putting on a dusty historical artifact from 1979.
Because of how we live right now.
Yes, constantly bombarded by fragmented digital notifications, doom scrolling through terrible news, living in a state of perpetual hyper-connected crisis.
So plugging into the chaos of this heat feels like plugging directly into the raw, unfiltered reality of the present moment.
It honestly is a profound realization.
To summarize this incredibly dense, condensed lifespan, this heat existed for a mere fraction of the time that most major stadium bands do.
Just a few chaotic years, 2 full albums, and 1 EP.
But the sheer density, the absolute acoustic mass of their work, outmatched bands that have been coasting for decades.
They weren't just being weird for the sake of confusing people.
No, they matched their bizarre, avant-garde tape splicing methods perfectly with the genuine existential dread of the era they were trapped in.
The physical medium they worked in, the harshness of their instruments, and the terror of their message were entirely unified.
And I think that is the ultimate takeaway for you listening right now. Immersing yourself in a band like this heat completely changes how we perceive music and really any form of art during incredibly hard times.
We are so conditioned to think of art as an escape.
When things get bad, we want a catchy pop song to take our minds off the news. We want catharsis.
But art isn't always meant to be an escape hatch from anxiety.
Sometimes the most vital art is the exact architectural blueprint of that anxiety. It helps us process the invisible chaos surrounding us by giving it a physical, tangible shape.
An acoustic form that we can actually examine, hold, and understand.
It forces us to sit with the tension, to face the friction of our reality, rather than just hiding from it behind a simple melody.
Exactly.
Which leaves me with a final provocative thought for you to mull over as you go about the rest of your day. We've spent this entire time dissecting how Charles Hayward, Charles Bullen, and Gareth Williams used physical tape splices, broken treadmills of rhythm, and harsh metallic noise to perfectly capture the suffocating nuclear dread of the 1970s.
That analog tension.
Right. If that was the undeniable sound of the analog Cold War, what everyday tools, what mundane digital sounds are being manipulated in some makeshift modern-day cold storage right now?
That's a great question.
If someone wanted to engineer the perfect acoustic capture of our current hyperconnected algorithmic doom-scrolling anxiety, what does that sound like? Keep your ears open, because whoever is making it, you might already be listening to it.